This is the story of TWA Flight 542. On the 20th of August 1973, a Boeing 707 was to fly from Mueang International Airport to San Francisco International Airport. But this was not a direct flight. It had stops. The plane was supposed to stop at Kaitak in Hong Kong, Taipei in Taiwan, Okinawa, Japan, Guam, the US, Honolulu, the US, then LA, and before finally getting into San Francisco. Imagine riding that flight from one end to the other. That would have been an experience. The plane had 141 passengers and 11 crew members on board. Before we go on, can we just marvel at the fact that a modern narrow-body like the 737 or the A320 is capable of doing what a giant quadjet did in the 1970s? In fact, planes like the A321 or the 757 can fly more passengers on a longer route with 2 fewer engines and in a smaller footprint. We really are living in the future. But let's get back to the story of Flight 742. We join the jet as the plane closes in on LA from Honolulu. The jet is at 33,000 feet with nothing out of the ordinary. The pilots are in contact with LAX Center. At 9:29 p.m., the controller gave the crew the all clear to take the plane down to 11,000 feet. And so the crew disengaged the autopilot and started to take the plane down. In the cabin, the entertainment for the night had just ended and the cabin crew members were making their way around the plane, starting to prep it for landing. A few people stood around the lavatories. As the cabin crew members worked their way, the pilots flew the plane, bringing it down to their assigned altitude of 11,000 feet. As they were passing 22,000 feet, the plane was at about 350 knots. Then, all hell broke loose. Out of nowhere, the plane's nose pitched up violently. Then, almost as instantly as it had gone up, the nose dropped, and then the cycle repeated. The crew verified that the autopilot was indeed turned off, and they quickly turned on the fasten seatbelt sign. The situation looked like it would get worse before it got better. The nose would go up and then down and then up and then down. The flight data recorder recorded 50 such oscillations over the span of just 2 minutes. In the cockpit, the pilots frantically pulled back power on the engines and the flight engineer pulled the circuits to the rudder power, mach trim, and the yaw damper. If any of these subsystems were causing these control issues, then that should have fixed the problem. But the problem still persisted. The first officer and the captain were both working together to get the plane under control. They were trying to counteract the oscillations the best that they could. But as they wrestled with the plane, the jet lost speed and altitude. By the time the jet was at 19,500 feet, the oscillations had somewhat dampened and the plane was kind of under control. The pilots would have been shaken by what had just happened. They tested the controllability of their jet to see what their plane could and couldn't do. That information would be crucial in the upcoming landing. If there was something wrong with their jet, they needed to know about it now. A controllability issue popping up right before landing would be a very bad thing, as the pilots would not have the time or altitude to recover from an upset. But the plane checked out fine. The controls were all normal, except for a little bit of stiffness when they pushed the yoke forward. But they had another problem: the people on board. A lot of people had been standing when the upset happened. The ones who were unlucky enough to make it to a seat in time were thrown from the floor to the ceiling multiple times as the plane oscillated. Some people were badly hurt and they needed to get this plane down on the ground as soon as possible. One of the flight attendants was a Navy flight surgeon and 2 of the passengers on board had medical experience. The 3 of them started treating the badly injured people the best that they could with the limited amount of resources that they had. The pilots told LAX Approach to have emergency vehicles meet them on the runway as soon as the plane landed. As they were having this conversation with the controllers, the TWA technical team was made aware of what had happened to Flight 742. They were trying to provide the pilots with all the information that they could possibly need to get this plane on the ground. With that, the pilots were better prepared for any eventuality that may come up. After running a few more tests, the crew of Flight 742 declared a full emergency. LAX cleared them right in for an ILS approach to runway 7 left. The 707 touched down at 10:43 p.m. local time. But unfortunately for one passenger, it was too late. He or she did not make it. 4 other people were hospitalized due to injuries that they had sustained during the upset. This accident is a perfect example of why you should have your seatbelt fastened when you're in an aircraft. You never know when you're going to hit a patch of bad turbulence or when the plane's going to have a control issue. It's a small thing that can go a long way in keeping you safe. But why did this happen? What caused the jet to pitch up out of nowhere when it was supposed to be in a shallow descent? For an upset like this, you basically have 4 main causes: turbulence, pilot error, a basic design flaw with the jet, or a problem with the control system of the jet. Now, Most of these were easy enough to rule out. The weather reports cleared out turbulence. The air was clear and there was nothing that could have caused turbulence. As for point 2, there have been cases where a pilot accidentally moving a lever in the cockpit has caused accidents. I'll have a video about that at the end of this video if you want to watch that. But in this case, the flight data recorder exonerated the pilots. Nothing that they did caused the upset. All the inputs that they made prior to the upset was in line with what they should have been doing. So, what about a systemic issue with the Boeing 707? Well, not really. The 707 had been in service for 15 years, and no control issues had been reported about the jet so far. So it was unlikely that the basic design of the 707 had something to do with this accident. That left the investigators with one option. Something was wrong with the control system of this jet. Looking into the history of the 707, they found 2 other incidents that mimicked this one. In both cases, the fault was with the longitudinal control system of the plane, or the system that helps the plane of the nose go up or down. So the investigators got to work to see if the accident plane had this flaw. Before we get into why this happened, we need to understand a few fundamental principles of flight. The first one being trim. What exactly is trim? Trim in very simple terms is a way to adjust the control surfaces on a plane so that it maintains a set attitude without any control inputs. So for example, if you trim the plane nose up, the plane will nose up even if you don't touch the yoke. If you lose an engine, you can trim the plane to counteract the thrust asymmetry, meaning that you as the pilot don't have to constantly counteract that force. On all modern planes, the trim can be actuated by the pilot and the autopilot. For example, as the plane flies, it burns fuel, and so the center of gravity of the plane changes. As the flight progresses, the computers will trim the plane to keep it level. Now, the next thing we need to learn about is the difference between the stabilizer and the elevator. In non-aviation circles, the two are used interchangeably, but they're different. The stabilizer is the horizontal wing-like structures that stick out at the back of the plane, while the elevators are little flaps at the back of the stabilizer. Now, I'll throw a picture of it up on the screen so that you understand it better. Now, the investigators found something on the accident plane that was almost immaterial. It was a small detail that was so easy to overlook, but it looked like it would be the key to solving this accident. The airplane skin on the left stabilizer was a little bit wavy, meaning that it wasn't perfectly smooth. In addition to that, the elevator wasn't mated to the stabilizer in the right way. Instead of being perfectly flush, the left-hand elevator was out of line by the slightest bit towards the bottom. These two things had some very subtle but important effects on the jet. This basically meant that the air flowing over the elevator was thickened. The report calls this a thickened boundary layer, but this subtly messed with the aerodynamics of the airplane. We'll get back to how that affected Flight 742, but now we have to look at the automation side of things. Remember how I told you that the autopilot would trim the plane when it was in flight to counteract the center of gravity changes caused by the fuel being burned and a whole host of other factors? Well, here's how the autopilot on the 707 did that. When the computer detected that the plane's center of gravity was changing, it would move the elevators just a little bit to compensate. Now, the autopilot does not have free reign over the elevators. There's something called a stabilizer trim threshold. Once the elevators were sufficiently deflected, the computer's like, okay, the trim threshold has been reached. Now I'm going to move the entire stabilizer to even out the forces that are acting on the plane. But you have to remember, due to the waviness of the stabilizer skin on the left-hand side, and due to the misaligned elevator, the aerodynamic properties of the longitudinal control system have fundamentally changed. The forces acting on the plane are completely different now. This meant that the autopilot was able to trim the elevator way beyond what would be normally possible, meaning that despite what the pilots thought, the 707 was out of trim when they were flying it. This is what caused the upset. The out of trim condition caused the sudden upset. Keep your jets trim, kids. But there's more to the story. Due to this condition, the flight characteristics of the plane had been altered. So when the plane pitched up, the pilots pushed the yoke forward to counteract the pitch. But due to the changed aerodynamics, this caused the plane to overreact. Here's a quote from the report. Quote, "When the control column force gradient is slow, the slight change in force applied by the pilot will result in an over-response by the aircraft. Such response will tend to cause a pilot to overcorrect any initially sensed pitch disturbance. This in turn will lead to an overcorrection in the opposite direction and thus induce an oscillation. The tendency to overcorrect will be magnified as the control column force gradient becomes negative. Continued efforts by the pilot to regain stable flight can result in a critical phasing between the pilot's control column movement and the aircraft's pitching motion, which will sustain rather than damp the oscillation." End quote. Basically, a small input to bring the nose of the plane down was magnified by the out-of-spec elevator, and that caused the nose of the plane to drop sharply. Then trying to correct that caused even more trouble. So every attempt to fix the problem just made it worse and worse. And that's how Flight 742 ended up in a pilot-induced oscillation. The biggest takeaway of this accident is not about aerodynamics or control surfaces or anything like that, but airplane interior design. It's not something that you think about a lot, but this accident showed that it was very, very important. After this accident, they were like, yeah, we need to redesign airplane interiors. We need to get rid of sharp corners. We need to make overhead bins stronger. Because if an upset like this happens again, then people might get hurt. And it worked. Upsets happen all the time these days. I just made a video about one a couple of weeks back, but no one dies from them anymore. And that right there is progress. Thank you for watching this episode of Mini Air Crash Investigation. If you like the videos that I make, do consider liking and subscribing. It will really help the channel grow. I will catch you guys next time. Stay safe.